In the spring of 1852, on a sprawling sugar plantation in Louisiana, a white man named Charles Beaumont was living a double life that defied every social convention of the antebellum South. Charles was a wealthy plantation owner, respected in white society, married to a prominent woman from a distinguished family. But Charles was also secretly raising and educating 4 mixed-race children as if they were his legitimate heirs, children born from his long-term relationship with an enslaved woman named Marie, who lived in a cottage on the plantation grounds. Charles spent his days managing his plantation and fulfilling his duties to white society, but his evenings were spent in Marie's cottage with the children, teaching them to read and write, discussing philosophy and literature, treating them with the affection and respect typically reserved only for white children of privilege. This arrangement had existed for over a decade, known to some enslaved people on the plantation but hidden from Charles's wife and from white society. The careful balance Charles maintained would eventually collapse, forcing him to choose between his secret family and his public life, revealing the profound contradictions of a man who owned people while loving some of them, who participated in slavery while trying to protect his own children from its worst aspects. Before we explore this complicated story of a plantation owner's secret family, his relationships with an enslaved woman and their children, and the impossible situation created by trying to maintain both a public white life and a private mixed-race family, we need to understand the world that made such arrangements both possible and ultimately unsustainable. This is Louisiana in 1852, 7 years before the Civil War, a society built on sugar cultivation and slavery, where rigid racial boundaries supposedly kept white and black people completely separate, but where reality was far more complicated. This is about Charles Beaumont, a man shaped by his society's values, but also in some ways rebelling against them, trying to create a private world where different rules applied while still participating in the public world of slavery and white supremacy. This is about Marie, an enslaved woman involved with the man who owned her, trying to protect her children and create some safety within an inherently unsafe situation. This is about 4 children caught between worlds, raised with privileges and education but legally enslaved, loved by their father but denied any public recognition or inheritance. This is about the impossibility of reconciling genuine family feeling with participation in slavery, about the limits of individual kindness within systematically evil structures, about children who would ultimately pay the price for their father's contradictions. Charles Beaumont was born in 1810 to a wealthy Louisiana family, inherited his plantation from his father in 1835, married Charlotte Devereaux in 1837 inches, a union that joined 2 prominent families and substantial fortunes. The marriage was conventional for their class, based on economic and social considerations rather than romantic love, and produced no children despite 15 years together. Charles and Charlotte lived largely separate lives, maintaining appearances for society while having minimal genuine connection or intimacy. Charlotte spent most of her time in New Orleans with her family, visiting the plantation only occasionally for social obligations, apparently content with the arrangement as long as Charles maintained her financial support and didn't create public scandal. Marie was born enslaved on Beaumont Plantation in 1820, daughter of a house servant and an unknown father. She worked in the main house from childhood, was intelligent and beautiful, attracted Charles's attention when she was 18 and he was 31. The relationship that developed between Charles and Marie in 1838 was shaped by profound power imbalance, with Charles owning Marie and having complete authority over her life. Charles convinced himself that Marie wanted the relationship, that their connection transcended the master-slave dynamic, that what they had was genuine despite the obvious coercion inherent in the situation. Marie's perspective on the relationship was undoubtedly more complicated than Charles understood or acknowledged. She had no ability to refuse Charles's advances without risking severe consequences, couldn't choose to end the relationship if she wanted to, had to participate in whatever Charles desired because he owned her. But Marie also seems to have developed some genuine attachment to Charles over time, appreciated the relative safety and privileges that being his favored woman provided, and eventually came to care about the children they had together in ways that went beyond simple survival strategy. Marie became pregnant in 1839 and gave birth to a son they named Louis in 1840. Charles was immediately devoted to the baby, spent hours in Marie's quarters visiting his son, began making plans for how to provide for Louis, even though the child was legally enslaved and couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Charles built a separate cottage for Marie and Louis, away from both the main house and the slave quarters, creating a private space where he could spend time with them without drawing attention from his wife or from white society. Over the next several years, Marie gave birth to 3 more children, a daughter named Claire in 1842, another son named Antoine in 1844, and another daughter named Isabelle in 1847. Charles was devoted to all 4 children, visited them daily in the cottage, brought them books and toys, began teaching them to read and write from early ages. This education was illegal, as Louisiana law prohibited teaching enslaved people to read, but Charles apparently felt his children should have the knowledge and skills that white children of his class received. The cottage became a kind of alternative family space for Charles, a place where he could be a father in ways his childless marriage didn't allow, where he could have intimate family life that his formal marriage lacked. Charles spent his evenings reading with the children, discussing ideas with them as they grew older, treating them with affection and respect that contradicted his public role as a slaveholder who viewed black people as inferior and property. The enslaved community on Beaumont Plantation was aware of Charles's relationship with Marie and his children, though the full extent of Charles's involvement with them may not have been clear to everyone. Some enslaved people resented Marie for her privileged position, felt she was benefiting from her relationship with the master while others suffered. Others sympathized with Marie's complicated situation, understood she was doing what she needed to do to survive and protect her children, recognized that her privileges were conditional and precarious despite appearances. The children themselves grew up in a strange liminal space, living in their own cottage rather than in the slave quarters, receiving education that other enslaved children didn't get, having a relationship with their father that was secret but real. They understood from early ages that they were enslaved despite being Charles's children, that their education and privileges had to be hidden from white people, that their very existence was scandalous and had to be kept secret. This knowledge shaped their identities in complex ways, made them aware of racial hierarchies while also being loved by a white father, made them privileged relative to other enslaved people while still being fundamentally powerless. Louis, the eldest, was particularly affected by the contradictions of his position. He was being educated like a white child of privilege, could read Latin and French, understood mathematics and philosophy, but was legally property who could be sold at any time. As he entered his teenage years, Louis began to question the arrangement more directly, to push his father about why they had to remain enslaved if Charles truly cared about them, to challenge the fundamental contradiction of being loved by someone who owned him. Charles struggled with these questions from his eldest son, couldn't provide satisfactory answers that reconciled his genuine affection for his children with his refusal to free them. Charles told himself and his children that freeing them would draw dangerous attention, that Louisiana law made manumission difficult, that they were safer remaining on the plantation where he could protect them, than being freed and vulnerable in a society hostile to free black people. These justifications were partly true but also served to avoid the deeper truth that freeing his children would require Charles to confront the fundamental evil of slavery and his own participation in it. The situation became more precarious as the children grew older and more visible. A cottage containing 4 mixed-race children who looked increasingly similar to Charles, who were educated beyond what enslaved people should be, who had privileges that drew comment from white visitors to the plantation, created risks that increased over time. Charles tried to maintain the secret by limiting who knew about the cottage and by keeping the children away from white observers, but complete secrecy was impossible. Charlotte, Charles's wife, learned about Marie and the children around 1850, probably through gossip from enslaved house servants, or from white visitors who had noticed the cottage and its unusual inhabitants. Charlotte's response was shaped by conventional expectations for plantation mistresses discovering their husbands had relationships with enslaved women. She was angry about the public evidence of Charles's infidelity, embarrassed by how visible the arrangement had become, concerned about potential claims the children might make on Charles's estate. But Charlotte was also trapped by her own position, couldn't leave the marriage without losing her financial security and social standing, had to find ways to manage the situation without creating open scandal. Charlotte demanded that Charles end his visible relationship with Marie and the children, insisted that he couldn't continue spending every evening in the cottage, threatened to return to her family permanently if he didn't make changes. Charles was torn between his wife's demands and his attachment to his secret family, tried to negotiate some middle ground that would satisfy Charlotte while allowing him to maintain connection with Marie and the children. The compromise Charles attempted was to reduce the frequency of his visits to the cottage, while continuing to provide for Marie and the children financially, to be more discreet about the relationship while not ending it completely. This compromise satisfied no one. Charlotte remained angry about the situation's continued existence. Marie and the children felt abandoned by Charles's reduced presence. Charles himself was miserable, trying to maintain both relationships while fully satisfying neither. The situation reached a crisis in 1852, when Louis, then 12 years old, directly confronted Charles about their enslavement. Louis told his father that being educated and loved while remaining enslaved was torture, that knowing he had a white father who owned him made the enslavement worse, rather than better, that Charles needed to free them or admit he didn't really love them at all. This confrontation forced Charles to face questions he had been avoiding, to recognize that his compromised position of loving his enslaved children without freeing them was causing them suffering and couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Charles began seriously considering how he might free his children, investigating Louisiana's manumission laws, trying to figure out what legal and practical steps would be required. He discovered that Louisiana had made manumission increasingly difficult in recent years, requiring special legislative approval for each case, demanding that freed people leave the state within a year of manumission, creating obstacles designed to prevent the growth of the free black population. Charles would need to petition the state legislature, would have to publicly acknowledge his relationship with Marie and his paternity of the children, would have to arrange for them to leave Louisiana permanently. The process would also require explaining the situation to Charlotte and getting her agreement, as wives had some legal standing to contest dispositions of marital property, including enslaved people. Charlotte made clear she would not agree to manumission that involved public acknowledgement of the children as Charles's, wouldn't cooperate with any plan that created scandal or that gave the children claims on the family estate. Her opposition effectively blocked the legal path to freeing the children while they remained in Louisiana. Charles considered other options, including illegally allowing the children and Marie to escape to the north, arranging for them to be secretly freed and relocated, finding some way to get them out of Louisiana and into freedom without going through legal channels. But all these options involved significant risks, could result in the children being captured and sold away if discovered, might endanger Marie and the children more than their current situation despite its problems. Marie's perspective on these debates about her and her children's future is difficult to recover from historical records, which focus primarily on Charles's dilemmas and feelings. Marie presumably wanted her children to be free, but also feared the dangers of attempting escape or illegal manumission. She had spent years creating relative safety for herself and her children within the constraints of slavery, had privileges that most enslaved people didn't have, faced losing those privileges if Charles's protection was withdrawn or if attempts at freedom failed. Marie's calculations about what was best for her children had to account for real dangers and limited options, couldn't be based on pure preference for freedom, without considering the practical challenges of achieving and maintaining it. The 4 children had different responses to the ongoing debates about their status and future. Louis was most insistent on freedom, most frustrated by the contradictions of their position, most willing to risk danger for the possibility of liberty. Claire was more cautious, worried about what would happen to her and her siblings if attempts at freedom failed. Antoine was still young enough to not fully grasp all the implications. Isabelle, the youngest, mostly wanted her family to stay together, and for her father to keep visiting and teaching her as he had before Charlotte's interference. The situation continued in uncomfortable stasis through 1852 and into 1853, with Charles unable to resolve the contradictions of his position, with Marie and the children living in uncertainty, with Charlotte demanding changes Charles wasn't willing to make. The fragile balance was maintained through all parties' willingness to avoid forcing the issue, through Charles's ability to keep providing for both his public and private families, through ongoing self-deception about whether the situation was sustainable. Then in 1854, Charles became seriously ill, developed a condition that made him confront his mortality, forced him to think about what would happen to Marie and the children after his death. Charles's will left most of his estate to Charlotte, with no provisions for Marie or the children because acknowledging them in the will would create the public scandal he had spent years avoiding. But Charles knew that without his protection, Marie and the children would be completely vulnerable, would likely be sold by Charlotte or by his heirs to settle the estate, would lose all the privileges and protections they had built. Charles wrote a secret codicil to his will, a private document not filed with the official will, instructing his lawyer to use a portion of Charles's estate to purchase freedom for Marie and the 4 children, and to provide them with funds to relocate to the north. This codicil was supposed to be revealed and implemented only after Charles's death, would allow him to free his secret family without creating scandal during his lifetime. The arrangement depended on Charles's lawyer following instructions that contradicted the official will and that might be challenged by Charlotte or other heirs. Charles died in 1856 at age 46, the illness that had started in 1854 eventually taking his life. The lawyer did attempt to implement the secret codicil, did try to use estate funds to purchase freedom for Marie and the children, did make efforts to honor Charles's wishes, but Charlotte and Charles's other heirs challenged these actions, argued that the codicil was invalid, and that Charles had no right to dispose of marital property in ways that benefited his enslaved mistress and illegitimate children over his legitimate wife. The legal battle over the estate and over Marie and the children's status lasted over a year. During this time, Marie and the children remained on the plantation in limbo, not knowing whether they would be freed as Charles had intended or sold to settle debts and satisfy Charlotte's claims. The uncertainty was agonizing. The children's education stopped. The relative safety they had known evaporated with Charles's death. The court ultimately ruled that the secret codicil was not binding, that Charles's official will took precedence, that Charlotte had rights to the estate, including the enslaved people on it, that superseded any private arrangements Charles had made. Marie and the children were ruled to be property of the estate subject to Charlotte's control, were not going to be freed or provided for as Charles had intended. Charlotte moved quickly to sell them, wanting them off the plantation and out of her life, no longer willing to maintain even the limited support that Charles had insisted on. Marie and the 4 children were sold together to a plantation in Texas in 1857, a deliberate choice by Charlotte to send them far away, where they couldn't make claims on the estate or remind anyone of Charles's secret family. The sale meant leaving Louisiana, losing any connection to the place where they had lived, starting over in new circumstances that likely didn't include the privileges and protections they had known under Charles's ownership. What happened to Marie and the children in Texas and beyond is not well documented, but general patterns suggest their lives became significantly harder without Charles's protection. They would have gone from being a master's acknowledged if secret family to being regular enslaved people purchased by someone who had no personal connection to them, would have lost their education and relative freedom, would have faced the full brutality of slavery without any mitigating factors. The children would have carried knowledge that their father had been a wealthy white man who had loved them but ultimately hadn't protected them, would have understood that his affection hadn't been enough to save them from slavery's violence. If any of them survived to emancipation in 1865, they would have been freed along with all other enslaved people, would have had to build lives in freedom, carrying the complicated legacy of their origins and their father's failures to protect them. Louis would have been 25, old enough to remember everything about his childhood in the cottage, about his father's teachings and affection, about his failure to secure their freedom. The memories of education and privilege would have made enslavement's brutality even harder to endure, would have created psychological suffering beyond the physical hardships. The story of Charles Beaumont's secret family, his attempt to love and educate his enslaved children while keeping them enslaved, his failure to protect them after his death, reveals the fundamental impossibility of reconciling genuine family feeling with participation in slavery. Charles convinced himself that he could be a good father to his children while owning them, that he could provide them with privileges and education that would somehow compensate for their enslavement, that his love for them was meaningful even though he refused to free them. But Louis's confrontation about the torture of being loved while enslaved revealed the truth. Charles's affection without freedom was cruelty dressed up as kindness. His education without liberation was psychological torment. The arrangement Charles created was better for Marie and the children than the situations many enslaved people faced, provided them with education and relative comfort, protected them from some of slavery's worst aspects. But it was also profoundly inadequate and ultimately failed completely when Charles died and couldn't or wouldn't arrange for their freedom. The privileges Charles provided were conditional and temporary, dependent on his continued life and his continued willingness to defy his wife and his society. When those conditions changed, Marie and the children lost everything and faced the full horror of being sold away and separated from everything they had known. Charles's inability to free his children during his lifetime, his choice to maintain his privileged position in white society rather than sacrificing that position to protect his secret family, his decision to keep them enslaved while convincing himself his love for them was genuine, all demonstrate the corrupting influence of slavery on moral reasoning and family feeling. Charles could not be both a slaveholder maintaining his social position and a truly protective father to his enslaved children. His attempt to be both ultimately failed, resulted in his children being sold away after his death, showed that his affection had been conditional and insufficient. Charlotte's role in the story reveals white wives' complicated positions within slavery and within marriages marked by their husbands' relationships with enslaved women. Charlotte had limited power relative to Charles during his lifetime but had enough power to make his relationship with Marie and the children more difficult, enough influence to prevent him from taking steps to free them. After Charles's death, Charlotte's legal rights as his widow allowed her to effectively nullify his secret wishes, to sell Marie and the children, to erase the secret family Charles had tried to maintain. Charlotte was both powerless in some ways and powerful in others, both victim of Charles's infidelity and perpetrator of the violence that sent Marie and the children into harsher slavery. The children's experience of being raised with education and affection while remaining enslaved created particular psychological difficulties that children raised without such privileges might not have faced. Louis's articulation of this being torture, of knowing he had a white father who owned him making enslavement worse, reveals how education and awareness could create suffering beyond simple ignorance. The children knew what freedom would mean, understood their father had the power to grant it, but chose not to, had to live with the contradiction between being loved and being owned. This awareness didn't make their enslavement easier, but rather made it more psychologically complex and painful. Understanding this story requires recognizing that individual kindness or affection cannot overcome systemically evil structures, that Charles's love for his children was real but insufficient, that good intentions without structural change and genuine sacrifice of privilege cannot create justice. Charles wanted to be a good father but wasn't willing to give up his position as a slaveholder and member of white society, wanted to educate and protect his children but wasn't willing to free them and face the social and economic consequences. This limited commitment meant his affection ultimately failed to protect his children and created psychological suffering that might have been avoided if he had either freed them early or maintained more emotional distance. The story stands as one more example of slavery's corruption of human relationships and family bonds, the impossibility of genuine love across the master-slave divide, the inadequacy of individual kindness within systematic oppression, and the lasting harm created when people tried to maintain contradictory positions rather than fully rejecting evil systems. The secret family Charles tried to maintain couldn't survive his death, because it had always depended on his continued willingness and ability to defy social norms without fully breaking with his society. Understanding such stories remains essential for grappling with slavery's full reality and its lasting impacts on American families across generations. The daily reality of life in the cottage for Marie and her children was marked by constant contradictions and careful management of multiple identities. During the day, particularly when white visitors were on the plantation, the children had to be kept out of sight, couldn't draw attention, had to behave like typical enslaved children if observed. During the evenings when Charles visited, they could be themselves, could discuss the books they were reading, could ask questions and debate ideas, could experience something resembling normal family life. This constant switching between personas was psychologically exhausting, required the children to develop sophisticated understanding of social performance and code switching from very young ages. The education Charles provided his children went far beyond basic literacy. Louis could read Latin and French by age 10, understood mathematics at a level comparable to white boys in expensive academies, had studied philosophy and history and literature in ways that few people of any race received. Claire showed particular aptitude for languages and music, learned to play piano on an instrument Charles had placed in the cottage. Antoine and Isabel received similar education appropriate to their ages. This education was both a gift and a burden, provided the children with knowledge and intellectual development that enriched their minds, but also made their enslavement more bitter and more difficult to endure. Marie's role in the cottage was complicated and multifaceted. She was Charles's partner in some ways, though the power imbalance meant true partnership was impossible. She was the children's mother and primary caregiver, responsible for their daily care when Charles wasn't present. She was also still enslaved, still subject to Charles's ultimate authority, still vulnerable to being sold or separated from her children if Charles chose to do so or if circumstances changed. Marie managed these multiple positions with apparent grace, created a stable home environment for her children while navigating the impossible situation of being owned by the father of her children. The relationship between Marie and Charles evolved over the years of their connection, became deeper and more complex than simple exploitation, even while never escaping the fundamental power imbalance that shaped it. Charles seems to have genuinely cared for Marie, valued her intelligence, and her role in raising their children, relied on her for emotional support that his marriage didn't provide. Marie seems to have developed real attachment to Charles despite the coercive origins of their relationship, appreciated his efforts to protect and educate their children, even while recognizing those efforts were ultimately inadequate. Their relationship was simultaneously exploitative and intimate, coerced and meaningful, a testament to how human connections could emerge, even in circumstances designed to prevent genuine equality. The enslaved community's varied responses to Marie's situation reflected broader tensions about how to relate to enslaved people who received privileges through relationships with masters. Some women resented Marie for benefits she gained through sexual involvement with Charles, felt she was collaborating with the oppressor, while other women were being exploited without compensation or protection. These women viewed Marie as selfish and as breaking community solidarity by accepting special treatment. Other women understood Marie was making the best choices available in impossible circumstances, was using the limited power her relationship gave her to protect herself and her children, was navigating situation most women would navigate similarly if given the chance. The men in the enslaved community had complex feelings about Charles's relationship with Marie and his role as father to mixed-race children. Some felt anger at Charles for exploiting Marie and then keeping their children enslaved, viewed the whole arrangement as additional evidence of white men's exploitation of black women. Others felt frustration that Marie's children were being educated while their own children couldn't be, saw the situation as creating harmful divisions within the enslaved community. A few expressed admiration for Charles's willingness to break with convention by educating his children, hoped this might indicate some possibility of white people recognizing black humanity. The four children's relationships with each other provided crucial support as they navigated their complicated positions. Louis, as the eldest, felt responsibility for his younger siblings, tried to protect them from the full weight of understanding their situation too early, absorbed much of the anger and frustration about their enslavement so his siblings could maintain more innocence. Claire, 2 years younger than Louis, was closest to her brother, shared his intellectual interests and his growing awareness of the contradictions they lived within. Antoine and Isabel, the younger children, looked to their older siblings for guidance and protection, relied on Louis and Claire to help them understand the complicated world they lived in. The cottage itself became a kind of sanctuary, a physical space that represented the alternative reality Charles was trying to create for his secret family. It was furnished comfortably, if not luxuriously, contained books and musical instruments and educational materials, was maintained by Marie, with support from house servants Charles directed to help her. The cottage was separate enough from both the main house and the slave quarters to provide privacy, but not so isolated that it drew suspicious attention. It existed in liminal space, neither fully part of the master's world, nor fully part of the enslaved community's world, reflecting the family's own ambiguous position. Charlotte's discovery of the cottage and its inhabitants forced confrontation that had been avoided through years of willful ignorance and careful secrecy. Some enslaved people who worked in the main house had undoubtedly known about Marie and the children for years, but had kept the secret, understanding that revealing it would create problems for everyone. But eventually gossip reached Charlotte through channels that couldn't be controlled, forced her to acknowledge what she may have suspected, but had been willing to ignore as long as it remained unofficial and deniable. The negotiation between Charles and Charlotte after her discovery revealed the power dynamics of their marriage and the limits of that power. Charlotte couldn't force Charles to end his relationship with Marie completely, couldn't make him stop supporting his children, didn't have legal authority to sell Marie and the children without Charles's agreement, but she could make his life difficult, could threaten to return to her family permanently, could create social pressure and emotional discomfort that made Charles willing to compromise. Charles couldn't simply ignore Charlotte's demands, needed to maintain his marriage for social and economic reasons, wanted to avoid the scandal that Charlotte's leaving would create. Louis's confrontation with Charles about the torture of being educated while enslaved was a turning point that forced Charles to recognize contradictions he had been avoiding. Louis articulated something Charles must have known at some level but had refused to fully acknowledge, that providing privileges and education without freedom was actually creating special suffering, that knowing their father was a powerful white man who could free them but chose not to was worse than ignorance would have been. This confrontation revealed the profound cruelty inherent in Charles's arrangement despite his good intentions, showed that love without liberation was inadequate and even harmful. Charles's investigation of Louisiana's manumission laws revealed how much the legal system was designed to prevent slaveholders from freeing enslaved people, even when they wanted to. The requirement for legislative approval, the mandate that freed people leave the state, the various financial and procedural obstacles, all worked together to make manumission difficult and rare. These legal barriers reflected Louisiana's commitment to maintaining slavery as an institution, to preventing the growth of a free black population that might threaten white supremacy, to making it as hard as possible for individual slaveholders to act on moral qualms or personal attachments by freeing enslaved people. The practical challenges of arranging illegal escape to the north were equally daunting. Charles would have needed to coordinate with underground railroad contacts, would have needed to provide Marie and the children with false documents and travel funds, would have needed to accept that he might never see them again if they successfully escaped. The risks were substantial, including the possibility that they would be captured during escape attempt, returned to slavery, and sold away as punishment. Charles's hesitation about pursuing this option reflected both genuine concern for their safety and his own unwillingness to accept permanent separation from children he loved. Marie's calculations about what was best for her children had to account for realities that Charles could avoid confronting. She knew that life as fugitives trying to reach the north would be extraordinarily dangerous, that being caught would result in sale to the deep south, or even death, that success would mean never seeing Louisiana again and starting over with no resources in unfamiliar territory. She also knew that their current situation, while uncomfortable and contradictory, provided her children with education and protection that most enslaved people never received. Marie had to weigh certain safety against possible freedom, had to make impossible choices with incomplete information about what the future held. The children's different responses to debates about their status reflected their different personalities and their different ages and developmental stages. Louis at 12 was old enough to fully understand their situation and to be deeply frustrated by its contradictions, was entering adolescence when questions of identity and autonomy become especially important, was developing the critical thinking that Charles's education had fostered, and turning it on their own circumstances. Claire at 10 was similarly intelligent and aware but more cautious by temperament, more willing to accept current safety rather than risking danger for possible freedom. Antoine at 8 and Isabelle at 5 were still young enough that the full implications weren't clear, still primarily wanted their family to stay together and their father to continue being present. Charles's secret codicil to his will represented his final attempt to resolve the contradictions of his life by protecting his secret family after his death. By creating this document separate from his official will, Charles tried to provide for Marie and the children's freedom and future support, without creating the immediate scandal that public acknowledgement would have caused. The arrangement depended on his lawyer's willingness to implement instructions that contradicted the official will and that would certainly be challenged by Charlotte and other heirs. Charles was essentially gambling that his lawyer's loyalty and commitment to honoring his wishes would overcome legal obstacles and family opposition. The lawyer's attempt to implement the secret codicil after Charles's death showed some genuine commitment to honoring Charles's wishes, even when doing so was legally and socially difficult. The lawyer did try to use estate funds to purchase Marie and the children's freedom, did attempt to provide them with money for relocation, did make efforts despite knowing these actions would be challenged, but the lawyer's power was limited, couldn't override the legal rights of Charles's widow and heirs, couldn't act against explicit provisions of the official will that took precedence over private instructions. Charlotte's aggressive opposition to the codicil and her quick move to sell Marie and the children revealed both her anger about the situation and her determination to remove all evidence of Charles's secret family. Charlotte had spent years living with knowledge of her husband's relationship with an enslaved woman and his children, had agreed to compromises that reduced Charles's involvement but didn't end it, had maintained her marriage despite humiliation and anger. After Charles's death, when she had power to act definitively, Charlotte chose to eliminate the problem by selling Marie and the children far away, where they couldn't make claims or remind anyone of Charles's double life. The sale to Texas was deliberately chosen to maximize distance and minimize possibility of future contact or claims. Texas was far from Louisiana, was still being developed as slave territory, had its own brutal plantation system, where Marie and the children would disappear into anonymous enslaved labor force. Charlotte wanted them gone permanently, wanted to ensure they couldn't return or create problems, wanted to erase Charles's secret family from existence as much as possible. The loss of everything Marie and her children had known, the transition from relative privilege to harsh slavery, the separation from the only home they had known, all constituted profound trauma that would have affected them for the rest of their lives. The children would have gone from being educated in a cottage with books and musical instruments to being field laborers or domestic servants with no recognition of their intelligence or capabilities. The knowledge they carried about Charles and their previous life would have made the contrast more painful, would have created ongoing grief about what they had lost. Louis, in particular, would have struggled with the transition from educated young man engaging with philosophy and literature to enslaved laborer whose intellectual development meant nothing to new owners who saw him only as property. The education that had been meant as a gift would have become a source of additional suffering, would have made his enslavement more psychologically unbearable, because he could fully understand everything that was being stolen from him. His memories of his father teaching him, of discussions about freedom and rights and human dignity, would have been torturous reminders of the gap between what his life could have been and what it actually was. If Louis survived to emancipation in 1865, he would have been 25 years old, would have spent 9 years in harsh slavery after knowing relative privilege, would have carried memories of his father's affection and his father's failures throughout the war years. Freedom would have come too late to recover his youth, or to access the education and opportunities his father had intended for him to have. Louis would have had to build a life in freedom carrying the psychological scars of enslavement and the complicated legacy of having been Charles Beaumont's son without receiving any of the benefits that relationship should have provided. The broader implications of this story for understanding slavery include recognition that individual kindness could not overcome systematic evil, that privileges provided within slavery were always conditional and ultimately inadequate, that education and awareness could create additional suffering within slavery rather than alleviating it. Charles's genuine affection for his children didn't protect them. His education of them created expectations and awareness that made their ultimate fate more cruel. His attempts to maintain both white privilege and black family failed catastrophically at his death. The story shows the profound corrupting influence of slavery on human relationships, the impossibility of being both slaveholder and truly loving father to enslaved children, the inadequacy of any arrangement that tried to reconcile participation in evil with individual moral action. The story also reveals how white women's limited power within marriage could still be deployed to cause tremendous harm to enslaved people, how Charlotte's legal rights as a widow allowed her to destroy the secret family Charles had tried to protect, how women who were themselves oppressed by patriarchy could still participate in racial oppression, and could use what power they had to punish enslaved people. Charlotte's sale of Marie and the children was an act of violence enabled by her position as Charles's legitimate wife, demonstrated that being oppressed in one system didn't prevent people from oppressing others in different systems. Understanding this story requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. Charles genuinely loved his children but failed to protect them adequately. Marie was exploited but also made strategic choices to protect herself and her children. The children were privileged relative to other enslaved people but still suffered profoundly from enslavement. Charlotte was wronged by Charles's infidelity but also perpetrated violence against Marie and the children. The story resists simple moral categorization, reveals the complicated ways people navigated impossible situations while making choices that created harm alongside whatever good they might have intended. The story stands as testament to slavery's corruption of every human relationship it touched, and to the inadequacy of individual goodness within systemically evil structures. The psychological impact on the four children of growing up, knowing they were Charles Beaumont's children, but being denied any public acknowledgement, created identity complications that would have affected them throughout their SPS lives. They knew their father was a wealthy, powerful white man but couldn't claim that heritage, knew they had white half-siblings through Charles's legitimate family connections but couldn't have relationships with those relatives, knew they were being educated like white children of privilege, but would never be allowed to use that education in ways similar children could. This knowledge created a particular form of psychological suffering that enslaved children who didn't know their white parentage might not have experienced. The children's relationships with other enslaved people on the plantation were complicated by their special status and by the resentments their privileges created. Some enslaved children their age refused to play with or befriend Charles's children, viewed them as aligned with the master, resented their education and their comfortable cottage and their obvious preferential treatment. Other children were curious about them and tried to build friendships but found the differences in education and privileges created barriers to genuine connection. The four Beaumont children existed in social isolation, neither fully part of the enslaved community nor accepted by white society. Marie's efforts to help her children navigate their complicated identities required constant, careful management. She had to teach them to be proud of their intelligence and capabilities, while also teaching them to hide those qualities from white people who would view educated enslaved people as threatening. She had to help them understand their father's genuine affection, while also teaching them not to expect that affection would result in freedom or protection. She had to prepare them for the possibility that circumstances might change suddenly, that the privileges they enjoyed could disappear at any moment if Charles died or if his protection was withdrawn for other reasons. The books and educational materials in the cottage represented both Charles's genuine investment in his children's intellectual development and his own contradictions about slavery and racial hierarchy. Charles taught his children ideas about human equality and natural rights, while simultaneously keeping them enslaved. He read them philosophy about liberty and dignity while denying them liberty and treating them as property. The children, particularly Louis as he grew older, couldn't help but notice these contradictions and to question how their father could teach them about freedom while refusing to free them. Charlotte's insistence that Charles reduce his visible involvement with Marie and the children created additional pain for the family by reducing Charles's presence without ending the fundamental situation. The children went from seeing their father every evening to seeing him irregularly, from having his full attention and affection to having a diminished relationship that felt like abandonment. Charles's reduced presence didn't satisfy Charlotte's demand that he end the relationship completely, but did create suffering for Marie and the children who experienced it, as withdrawal of love and support even though Charles tried to maintain connection. The legal battle after Charles's death must have been agonizing for Marie and the children to witness and endure. They had hoped that Charles's secret codicil would result in their freedom and their ability to build new lives. Had to wait over a year while lawyers and heirs fought over whether Charles's wishes would be honored. Had to exist in terrible uncertainty about their futures. When the court ruled against the codicil, and in favor of Charlotte's rights as widow, when they learned they would not be freed but would be sold instead, the devastation must have been profound, and the sense of betrayal overwhelming. The fact that all 4 children were sold together to Texas was somewhat unusual, as families were often separated in sales, and may reflect Charlotte's desire to be rid of all of them at once, or may reflect the buyer's understanding that educated children might be more valuable, kept together. The children's ability to stay together provided some comfort even as they lost everything else, meant they had each other for support as they faced the terrible transition to harsh slavery. But staying together also meant they shared the grief and trauma, couldn't escape reminders of what they had lost, because their siblings carried the same memories and pain. The buyer who purchased Marie and her 4 children would have gotten an unusual acquisition. 5 enslaved people, including 4 children with education far beyond what was typical, all healthy and capable, all connected by family bonds that might make them more cooperative, or might make them more dangerous if they tried to support each other in resistance. The buyer may have recognized the children's education as valuable, or may have viewed it as threatening, may have tried to use their capabilities, or may have tried to break them through harsh treatment designed to eliminate any remaining pride or sense of self-worth. The transition from Louisiana to Texas would have involved forced travel, separation from everything familiar, arrival in new territory where they knew no one and had no history or community connections. The children would have lost not just their cottage and their privileged position but also any relationships they had built with other enslaved people in Louisiana, any knowledge of the local geography and social landscape, any sense of place or belonging. They would have become truly rootless, displaced from the only home they had known, forced to start over in circumstances that were worse than what they had left. The question of whether Marie ever told her children the truth about how hard she had tried to protect them, about the choices she had made, and the calculations she had performed, trying to keep them safe, about her own conflicted feelings about Charles and their situation, is important for understanding how the family processed their experiences. Marie may have felt guilt about participating in the arrangement with Charles, about accepting privileges that came at the cost of her children growing up enslaved, despite being a wealthy man's children. Or she may have felt she had made the best choices available and had nothing to apologize for, had protected her children as well as anyone could have in impossible circumstances. The children's feelings about their mother would have been complicated by understanding, as they grew older, how limited her choices had been and how much she had tried to protect them within those constraints. They may have recognized that Marie had used the only power available to her, the power that came from Charles's attachment to her, to create relative safety and educational opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Or they may have felt that Marie should have refused Charles, should have protected them from the psychological damage of being loved by a father who kept them enslaved, should have chosen some different path, even though alternatives were scarce and dangerous. The loss of Charles's protection meant not just loss of privileges, but also loss of hope that circumstances might improve, loss of any possibility that their father might eventually fulfill his promises to free them, loss of any remaining connection to the world of education and intellectual development they had known. The children would have had to adjust not just to harsher physical conditions, but to the psychological reality that their father's affection and his deathbed wishes hadn't been enough to save them, that Charlotte's anger and legal rights had outweighed everything Charles had tried to do for them. Louis's memories of confronting his father about the torture of being educated while enslaved would have been particularly painful after being sold to Texas. Louis would have known he had been right, that his father's affection without freedom had been inadequate and cruel, that the education that was supposed to be a gift had become a curse that made harsh slavery even more unbearable. But Louis might also have felt guilt about that confrontation, might have wondered if pushing his father had contributed to the stress that killed Charles, might have wished he could apologize or explain or have one more conversation. The practical challenges of maintaining their education and intellectual development in Texas without Charles's support and protection would have been immense. They would have had no access to books, no time for study, no encouragement to use their minds, no safe space to discuss ideas or to maintain the knowledge they had gained. The education Charles had provided would have atrophied from disuse, would have become hidden knowledge they couldn't express or develop, would have marked them as different in ways that were dangerous rather than valued. If the children survived to emancipation and freedom, they would have had to figure out how to use their education and capabilities in a world that wasn't prepared to recognize educated, formerly enslaved people as valuable. The knowledge they had gained might have provided some advantages in freedom, might have allowed them to access opportunities that illiterate, formerly enslaved people couldn't access. But that knowledge would also have been accompanied by memories of how it was gained and what it had cost them, by awareness of everything that had been stolen from them when Charlotte sold them away. The story of Charles Beaumont's secret family ultimately reveals the fundamental impossibility of reconciling genuine family love with participation in slavery, the inadequacy of individual kindness within systematic evil, the failure of education and privilege to protect people who remained enslaved, and the lasting trauma created when children were raised with expectations and awareness that couldn't be fulfilled. Charles's love for his children was real, but insufficient. His education of them created additional suffering rather than alleviating their enslavement. His failure to free them in time meant his affection became a source of pain rather than comfort. Marie's protection of her children within the constraints available to her represented survival and strategic choice, but couldn't prevent their ultimate suffering and loss. The children's experience of being raised as loved children of a wealthy father, but being sold away as enslaved property after his death, demonstrated the profound cruelty and corruption at slavery's heart. Understanding this story requires recognizing that individual moral action within evil systems is both important and inadequate, that people who tried to mitigate slavery's harms, while continuing to participate in it, ultimately failed to protect the people they claimed to love, that the psychological damage created by contradictions and betrayed expectations could be as harmful as physical brutality. The story honors Marie's survival and her efforts to protect her children while acknowledging the limits of what she could achieve, honors Charles's genuine affection while condemning his failure to free his children, honors the children's resilience while recognizing the profound harm done to them by circumstances their parents created and couldn't resolve. The story stands as testament to slavery's corruption of every human relationship, and to the inadequacy of love without liberation, remaining essential for understanding the full reality of slavery and its lasting impacts on American families across generations.